If you look at the raw data for a country that has endured 75 years of almost continuous, violently contested history, your intuition tells you to expect a wasteland.
Oh, absolutely. You expect total collapse.
Right. You expect a shrinking population, plummeting life expectancy, and just, a total regression to the Dark Ages.
Yeah, a complete demographic and economic crater.
But today, we are taking you on a deep dive into a massive, multidimensional academic data report titled The Sisyphus Trap of Afghanistan's Modernization, 1946 to 2025. And it presents a paradox that completely shatters all of those assumptions.
It really does. It forces a total cognitive inversion.
Right.
Because the World Bank population metrics from this report alone are just staggering.
They really are.
Between 1950 and 2021, the population of Afghanistan didn't shrink. It grew from roughly 7.7 million people to nearly 40 million.
Which is an explosion. 40 million people.
Exactly. And life expectancy. It went from a baseline of 27 years in 1950 to 64 years by 2021.
Oh, wow. So it more than doubled.
It did. Those are metrics of a thriving, exploding society, not a dying one.
Right, and that's what makes this analysis so compelling for you listening. I was going over those specific numbers on the first page of the report, and they have this striking minimalist line chart.
Oh, I love that chart. The visual is so stark.
It really is. There's this huge upward arrow showing the population skyrocketing, and if you just handed me those spreadsheets on human development, I'd assume I was looking at a roaring success story of international development.
Anyone would, yeah.
But then right next to it, there's a massive red downward arrow. Because when you cross-reference those human metrics with the state's institutional health, specifically the Regime Durability Index, that's where the illusion breaks.
Right. The structural framework just disintegrates.
Exactly. Because while the population is quadrupling, the structural framework of the country repeatedly suffers absolute cliff drop resets. The Regime Durability Index, which is tracked as the patterable metric, literally flatlines to 0 in 1973.
Yeah.
Then again in 1978. Again in 1992. Again in 2001. And once more in 2021.
That is the core of the Sisyphus trap we are examining in this deep dive today.
The boulder rolling down the hill.
Right. But the tragedy isn't just that the boulder rolled back down the hill. It's that the boulder was getting heavier, with 40 million people, while the rules of physics were changing every 20 years.
That's a terrifying way to put it, but it's true.
We have to be very careful, and the report stresses this, not to conflate biological survival with state survival. People were living longer due to imported medical aid, but the actual state was incredibly fragile.
So the data reveals that the modernization the world celebrated was almost entirely disconnected from the social foundations of the country itself.
Precisely. It was a statistical mirage.
Well, I want to dig right into how that disconnect happened because the report maps this out across 3 very distinct eras. The timeline infographic on page 2 is fascinating.
It really sets the stage.
It begins with what the data calls the stable start, running from 1946 to roughly 1972.
The late monarchical period.
Right. And looking at the regime durability metrics, this is the only time we see a long, unbroken stretch of institutional accumulation. The index hits a peak of 41 years of continuous stability.
Which is an incredibly vital baseline to establish for our listeners.
Yeah. Why is that 41 years so important?
Because 41 years of stability means an entire generation grew up, entered the workforce, and participated in civic life under a single, consistent set of rules.
Okay, so the rules of the game didn't change on them overnight.
Exactly. During this monarchical period, modernization was certainly happening, but it was slow. It was organic. The state wasn't attempting to forcibly drag rural tribal structures into the 20th century overnight.
They were just nudging it along.
Right. They were building infrastructure, expanding education, and experimenting with constitutional reforms, but doing so within the existing social consensus.
I noticed that. The data doesn't show massive, multi-billion-dollar spikes in foreign development aid during this period. The growth was incremental.
Very incremental.
It makes me think about how institutional memory is actually formed. It's not just about writing laws on a piece of paper, right?
No, not at all.
It's about the slow habituation of a society to those laws. The rural farmer and the urban merchant both kind of know how to navigate the system, even if the system is flawed.
Precisely. Organic evolution allows for friction without total collapse. You can have disagreements, you can have protests, but the state doesn't shatter.
But then, of course, it does shatter.
It does.
Mm.
That 41-year accumulation comes to a violent halt. In 1973, we see the first total reset to zero.
Right, the monarchy is overthrown, replaced by a republic, and the country enters what the report designates as the shock transition era.
Which lasts all the way until 2001.
And the data from this era is just pure volatility. The report tracks the polity index, the polity 2 metric, which measures how democratic or autocratic a regime is.
Yes, on a scale from 10 to -10.
Right, and during this window, the needle is swinging wildly. It plummets into the absolute extremes of totalitarianism, hits a -10, bounces back slightly to a -7, and then crashes again.
It's a period of immense trauma.
We are talking about the Republic reforms, the violent communist coup in 1978, the subsequent Soviet intervention, and then the brutal civil war of the 1990s.
Can I actually caution against just viewing it as a swinging pendulum?
Oh, why is that?
Because a pendulum implies it's moving back and forth across the same axis. What the data actually suggests, and the report makes this very clear, is that Afghanistan was being used as a high-cost, low-return laboratory for completely incompatible political systems.
Oh, wow. A laboratory. That makes a lot of sense when you look at the regime types.
Think about the sequence. You transition from a traditional decentralized monarchy to a Soviet-backed, highly centralized one-party socialist state.
Which is a massive ideological whiplash.
Huge. And then that collapses into a fragmented landscape of warlords, which is then replaced by the rigid theocratic system of the First Islamic Emirate.
That sequence is exactly why this isn't just a typical story of a developing nation having a rough century.
No, it's something entirely different.
I was thinking about how nations usually evolve. If you look at the turbulent periods in European history, even through revolutions, the new systems usually co-opt or build upon the bureaucratic foundations of the old ones.
They keep the clerks, right, they keep the tax collector.
Exactly. But the data here shows a total deletion of the underlying civic code.
The report refers to it as formatting the institutional hard drive.
Formatting the hard drive, that is such a perfect metaphor.
Because you cannot install a Soviet-style planned economy running for a decade, violently wipe the servers, and then try to boot up a traditional Islamic emirate using the remnants of that same bureaucratic hardware.
It's completely incompatible.
Exactly. Every time that red vertical line appears on our timeline in 1973, 1978, 1992, and 2001, it represents the execution or exile of the previous era's technocrats, judges, and administrators.
So the human capital required to run a modern state is physically removed from the board.
Wiped clean.
So cross-generational accumulation of progress becomes mathematically impossible.
Yes.
Which leads us to the third era, right? By the time we hit the greenhouse leap, which is the period from 2002 to 2021.
The era of massive international intervention.
Right. You have international powers coming in to build a Western-backed presidential republic. But they are building it on a foundation that has been aggressively pulverized for 30 years.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core economic illusion of that third era. Because if you just look at the GDP growth from 2002 onward, it looks like an absolute miracle.
I was absolutely struck by that specific chart on page 5. It's a bubble chart, right?
Yeah, the minimalist bubble chart mapping GDP against foreign aid.
Right. To a casual observer, if you just look at the GDP line, it looks like the country suddenly discovered a massive internal engine of prosperity. Factories being built, trade booming, a self-sustaining tax base forming.
A textbook economic takeoff.
But then the report overlays the foreign aid influx directly on top of the GDP curve, using the size of the bubbles to represent the aid totals. And the illusion completely vanishes.
It disappears.
The GDP wasn't an internal engine at all. It was a mere reflection of the foreign aid being pumped in.
It was what economists call a rentier state, but taken to an absolute extreme. The wealth was entirely exogenous.
Meaning it was generated outside the country.
Precisely. Let's look at the critical turning point in the data, the year 2010. Foreign aid hits its absolute peak. We're talking roughly $7.5 billion flowing into the country in a single year.
$7.5 billion. That is a staggering amount of capital for an economy of that size.
It is. And GDP is soaring at that exact moment. But the moment that aid begins to recede post-2010, the GDP growth doesn't just slow down. It hits a brick wall and flatlines.
So it was entirely dependent. It's like a patient on a massive IV drip of synthetic
It's
nutrients.
a good way to look at it.
As long as the bag is full and the flow is high, the patient looks flushed, energetic, and healthy. They're growing.
Right.
But the body isn't actually producing its own bone marrow. Remove the fry IV drip, and there's no internal mechanism to sustain the life.
That is a harsh but remarkably accurate translation of the data. And the researchers stress this. It was a blood transfusion economy.
A blood transfusion economy. Wow.
And the consequences of this become truly terrifying when you cross-reference it with the demographic data we mentioned earlier.
Right, the population boom chart from page 3.
Remember that quadrupled population? That growth wasn't evenly distributed across age groups. It created a massive, unprecedented youth bulge.
Right, the UN median age estimates. For long stretches of this period, the median age of the entire population hovered around 16.5 years old.
16.5. Think about the societal pressure of that single statistic.
Half of your country is under the age of 17.
You have millions of young men and women entering adulthood every single year. They have aspirations, they need purpose, and fundamentally, they need jobs.
But they are entering an artificial economy
Exactly.
because the economy isn't building factories or sustainable agriculture. It's built on servicing the international presence.
Yes, the economy is entirely tethered to the military and aid presence.
It's trucking contracts for military bases, translation gigs, private security, and administrative jobs in foreign-funded NGOs.
Exactly. So you have a ticking demographic time bomb.
Yeah.
An endless supply of energetic youth crashing against an economic scaffolding that is completely incapable of absorbing them the moment the foreign money scales back.
And what happens to all that energy?
When a society has immense building social pressure with no economic release valve, that energy naturally diverts into the informal, often illicit sectors.
Which perfectly bridges into the most frustrating data inversion in this entire report. It's on page 6.
The corruption heat map.
Yes. If billions and billions of dollars are pouring into the country to build these institutions to create this elusive bone marrow, why didn't it work? Where did the capital actually go?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question.
The report tracks the VDEM Corruption Index, specifically looking at perceived corruption within the executive branch. And the trajectory here defies all conventional development logic.
Conventional logic dictates that as you invest heavily in state building and institutional capacity, transparency should gradually improve.
Right, you're training auditors, you're building financial tracking systems, you're supposedly modernizing the bureaucracy.
But the data shows the exact opposite. As the volume of foreign aid rose, the corruption indices plummeted. They tracked perfectly, but inversely.
That is wild.
By that peak aid year of 2010, when that $7.5 billion was flooding the zone, transparency and executive accountability metrics froze at absolute rock bottom.
The bottom of the global charts.
Yes.
I was trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this. How does more money equal less institution? And it seems like a fire hose and teacup problem.
A fire hose and teacup. I like that.
You were taking billions of dollars and blasting it at a bureaucratic infrastructure that maybe had the capacity to absorb a few $100 million.
I think the fire hose analogy is incredibly illustrative, but it's important to understand the actual mechanics on the ground, which the report details.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When the institutional capacity to process, track, and legitimately deploy that capital simply does not exist, the money doesn't just evaporate.
Right, someone gets it.
It flows down the path of least resistance. And in a post-conflict society, the path of least resistance is controlled by patronage networks, regional strongmen, and off-the-books power brokers.
Because they are the only ones with the logistical capacity to actually move the resources.
Exactly.
If a foreign donor wants to build a highway, the central ministry might not have the engineers or the security forces to execute it. So they subcontract it to a regional power player who owns a trucking company and commands a local militia to guard the route.
Precisely. And that power player takes a massive cut, distributes the rest to his tribal affiliates to secure their loyalty, and the actual infrastructure project becomes secondary to the distribution of patronage.
The sheer volume of money deformed the state.
Deformed is the perfect word. The central government became a mechanism not for governing, but for capturing and distributing foreign rents.
This fundamentally altered the incentive structure for anyone in power. I mean, why do the grueling generational work of building a self-sustaining tax base when you can simply negotiate a larger aid package from international donors?
You wouldn't. The economic incentives were completely warped.
And the data shows this misallocation wasn't just happening through informal corruption. It was legally enshrined in the state's budget priorities.
Yes, let's look at the dual axis charts on page 7.
This is what the researchers call the guns versus books dilemma, right? Comparing military spending with education and social spending as a percentage of GDP.
It is a devastating visualization. If you trace the military expenditure metrics from the 1970s through the 1980s, especially during the Soviet intervention, and then again in the post-2001 era, militarization utterly eclipses social investment.
The gap is huge.
The state was pouring whatever resources it had and whatever foreign backing it received into a sprawling security apparatus.
But the tragic irony, as proven by the regime durability index we talked about earlier, is that buying more guns didn't buy stability.
No, it didn't at all.
It didn't extend the lifespan of the regimes. It just drained the internal momentum for actual social development. You're constantly treating the symptom, the insurgency, while ignoring the disease, which is the lack of a viable social contract.
That is a critical point. A massive military without a functional social contract is just an expensive mercenary force. And we see the hollowness of that social contract vividly when we examine the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index on page 10.
Right, the WJP index, the dashboard graphic in the report.
Exactly. Between 2012 and 2020, during the height of the international reconstruction effort, the formal justice metrics hovered dismally between 0.3 and 0.4 on a scale of 0 to 1.
0.3. That means the formal legal system was functioning at maybe a 30 to 40% capacity.
Barely functioning.
So what happens to the other 60%? Where do people go when they have a land dispute or a criminal complaint?
They go where they have always gone, to the informal traditional systems, the jirgas, the shuras, the local religious courts.
Which operate completely outside the central government.
Exactly. The data implication here is profound. It means the modern democratic constitution, the meticulously drafted legal codes, the expansive rights they existed almost entirely on paper.
They were phantom laws.
Phantom laws? Yes. The formal state was a facade, while the actual social control and dispute resolution on the ground were dictated by mechanisms the state neither controlled nor recognized.
This brings me to a part of the report that is incredibly difficult to parse because it deals with the genuine human triumphs of this era.
It is complicated, yes.
Despite the phantom laws and the hollow economy, we can't ignore the undeniable surge in the Human Development Index. The HDI metric climbed from roughly 0.35 in the year 2000 to 0.51 in 2019.
That is a massive leap.
And the gender data on page 8 and 9, this is the narrative of success that was broadcast to the world.
And we must be clear, those numbers represent real transformative changes in millions of individual lives. The data shows female literacy and female school enrollment jumping from near absolute zero in 2001 to between 30 and 40% over the next 2 decades.
Which is incredible. And politically, it was even more astonishing. By the 2010s, female political representation in parliament hit 27%.
27%.
I remember reading that in the report and realizing that metric actually surpassed the representation in several developed Western nations at the exact same time.
It did. But this is where the academic analysis must remain unsentimental. We have to ask why the report classifies these metrics as fragile triumphs and why they collapse so rapidly.
Right, the glass ceiling effect.
Yes. It goes back to the tearing of the social fabric. These incredible leaps in gender equality and human rights were largely top-down political mandates.
They weren't organic?
Exactly. They were decrees drafted in the capital, heavily subsidized by foreign aid and enforced by international pressure.
They were the penthouse suite of modernization.
The penthouse suite. I think that analogy serves us well here, yes. They built a gleaming 21st century penthouse of egalitarian rights, but they suspended it over a societal foundation that remained largely anchored in deeply traditional, centuries-old norms, particularly in the rural areas.
Right, because the state lacked the actual functional rule of law to enforce these progressive changes organically across the entire territory. So the progress became highly localized.
Very localized.
If you were in Kabul, you lived in that penthouse. You went to the university, you participated in civil society, you lived the metrics of the HDI surge. But if you were a farmer in a rural province, your reality was entirely different.
Which is physically mapped out in the infrastructure data on page 11. The report tracks the urban-rural divide using metrics like access to electricity and clean water.
And what does that show?
By 2019, the gap wasn't just wide, it was an absolute chasm. Modernization was intensely concentrated in what the researchers term internationally protected urban
Urban
islands.
islands.
Yes, cities like Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-e-Sharif became heavily fortified bubbles of modernity, complete with blast walls and stable generator grids.
I want to focus on that rural perspective for a second because I think it explains the resentment that fueled the instability.
It absolutely does.
Imagine you are that rural farmer. You are part of the vast majority of that booming population, part of the 40 million. You hear radio broadcasts about billions of dollars in development aid. You hear about new progressive laws and a democratic parliament.
But you don't see any of it.
Right. Your village still doesn't have paved roads, your crops are reliant on failing irrigation, and the only time you interact with the central state is when a corrupt police chief shakes you down at a checkpoint, or a military convoy roars through.
That alienation is the engine of the Sisyphus trap.
It's just a massive disconnect.
The physical segregation deepened the societal divide. When modernization is perceived not as a rising tide lifting all boats, but as an exclusive, corrupt club for urban elites backed by foreign armies, the rural population develops zero stake in defending that system.
Why would they shed blood to protect a penthouse they are not allowed to enter?
Exactly, they wouldn't.
So when the geopolitical winds shifted and the international scaffolding of military and financial support was removed in 2021,
Gravity simply took over.
gravity took over. The penthouse fell because it was never actually attached to the ground floor.
And the post-2021 data forecasts show a cliff-edge retraction of all those human development metrics. Female enrollment drops. The glass ceiling shatters,
The chain of human capital accumulation has been broken yet again.
fulfilling that tragic pattern of the institutional hard drive being violently wiped.
This brings us to the most sobering part of the report, the forecast for 2025 and beyond on page 14.
Because the timeline doesn't stop just because the regime changed again.
Right. The underlying pressures are still there. The people are still there. What do the trend lines indicate for the next decade?
We have to look at the collision of two specific data sets. First, the UN population predictions for 2030 and 2050. The exponential population pressure is not stopping.
That massive youth bulge we discussed?
Yes, they are entering their prime reproductive years. The population is projected to continue surging toward 50 or 60 million.
60 million people, without the billions in foreign aid.
Exactly. And the second data set we have to look at is the Economic Freedom Index and general indicators of institutional capacity.
And what do those show?
Those metrics remain completely flatlined.
So you have a mathematical certainty of rapidly expanding human needs, food, water, jobs, infrastructure, crashing against an economy that still possesses zero internal scaffolding.
And a state apparatus with severely limited technocratic capacity.
It's a terrifying equation. Without an internally generated system of law, without an economy that creates its own wealth instead of relying on foreign handouts or illicit trade, the cycle is practically guaranteed to repeat.
It is a mathematical trap.
The Sisyphus boulder is going to keep rolling down the hill, but the hill is getting steeper, and with 50 million people behind it, the boulder is getting impossibly heavy.
It forces a total reevaluation of how the global community defines success.
It really does.
For 75 years, the world essentially misdiagnosed Afghanistan because we were looking at the wrong vital signs.
We watched GDP rise, we watched life expectancy double, we saw hospitals and schools being built, and we assumed that modernization was an inevitable linear process.
But we were confusing the symptoms of massive foreign intervention with the vital signs of organic internal growth. The spreadsheets looked great, but the society was structurally hollowing out.
So what is the takeaway for the academic community, or really for anyone trying to understand nation building?
There are three core academic takeaways from this data that extend far beyond this single country's borders. First, a rapidly expanding population without the institutional capacity to absorb it is not a demographic dividend. It is a massive social explosive.
Right, the youth bulge bomb.
Second, foreign aid that does not catalyze internal wealth generation is not an economy. It is a mirage that collapses the moment the donors lose interest.
The blood transfusion without the bone marrow.
Precisely. And third, the ultimate tragedy is the disruption of institutional memory. Progress cannot survive if the political hard drive is formatted every 2 decades.
A nation cannot be built from scratch over and over by simply importing a new operating system and expecting the hardware to miraculously adapt.
It simply doesn't work. The social roots have to be there.
It's a profound reality check.
Hmm.
It proves that true modernization isn't a number you can inject into a spreadsheet from the outside.
No, it isn't.
It isn't an infrastructure project built by a foreign contractor or a constitution drafted by a distant committee. True modernization is a social consensus.
It has to be born organically.
It has to be born organically from the land and the people, forged through their own friction, their own struggles, and their own eventual agreements.
Absolutely.
So, as you step away from this deep dive, ask yourself a question. As you look at the metrics of success in your own life, your own society, your institutions, or even your workplace, are you looking at a deeply rooted organic foundation that can withstand a storm?
That's the real test.
Or are you just looking at the temperature in a greenhouse, waiting for the power to go out?